and welcome to Reading the Middle East with Gilles. Our guest this month is Emirati columnist and researcher Sultan Sooud al-Qassemi, founder of Barjeel Art Foundation and co-author and co-editor of the book Building Sharjah, co-edited with Todd Reisz. Sultan became interested in arts and culture at an early age. As he came to Paris to study economy and finance, he took that opportunity to visit our many museums, and no exhibition or art gallery was foreign to him. He also has a great command of French on top of his perfect English and native Arabic. Back home, he started to be interested in particular in the past half-century, from the early 1970s to the present day, when, to quote from his introduction to the volume we discussed today, quote-unquote, people of this land abandon arish or palm-frond huts and mud brick homes, and before, quote-unquote, the advent of 21st century glass and aluminium towers. As a way of introduction to the book and its co-author, I just spent some time in Sharjah last week, and I took that opportunity to visit the Barjeel collection of modern Arab art, where Sultan Sooud al-Qassemi has collected more than 1,000 paintings of the region, most of them by artists active during those elapsed 50 years. Let's start with a look at the collection in the company of the gallery curator, Dr. Suhaila Takesh, also a contributor to Building Sharjah.
These two works that we can see here were produced in the 1950s by Iraqi artists Jawad Salim and Shakir Hassan al-Said, who were the co-founders and co-authors of the Baghdad Group for Modern Art Manifesto, in which they began to identify and define what a national modern art would look like, what it would constitute, and declared that their aim is to merge ideas of, international modernity with local histories and heritage.
So, dear Sultan Sooud al-Qassemi, welcome to our Reading the Middle East podcast today. As you just saw, as I visited the Barjeel collection exhibits in the Sharjah Art Museum after reading your book, Building Sharjah, I was struck by the parallelism of purpose between the artwork that you have so patiently collected and the very contributions in the book. As if you were, in both cases, doing justice to this formative period of modernity in the Arabian coast of the Gulf, as if you were reconsidering the cultural processes at work, which now look somehow completely erased by the super-fast pace of globalization, just like most of the buildings you photographed in the book have been demolished. We shall see the remnants of some of them, which I captured with my smartphone last week, later on. Could you just update our viewers on that phenomenon?
First of all, I want to thank you, Professor Gilles, for hosting me here, and thank the wonderful team of Al Monitor, to which I have been a contributor for a number of years. I'm a big fan of both yourself and the publication. Professor Capel, I think that I feel like the world came full circle. In the 1990s, I was an Arab Emirati going to France, learning about French culture and French art. And now in 2021, you're a Frenchman coming to Sharjah, learning about Arab art. So this exchange that took place over the three decades, really, of my studying in Paris and then coming back here and creating a collection that can introduce the world to Arab culture, just like the museums that I visited, the Pompidou, the Orsay, the Louvre, introduced me to mostly Western culture. This is before the globalization that we see at the Pompidou today. And I think you are right. There are parallels between the book Building Sharjah and between Barjeel. Both concentrate on a period of time that is modern, the modern period, the period of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. In many cases, these periods have common elements, such as being post-independence. These periods have both movements, both time lapses have an element of forming national identity. So you are reflecting a sense of national identity through art, but also through architecture. And I am mostly interested in post-war modernity of the Arab world, whether it is architecture, art, but also literature and music and poetry.
One thing which is also very striking in your book is the influence of Iraqi modernity prior to the 1950s in Sharjah. This is a phenomenon that was first felt in Kuwait, that sort of predated the Trucial states in their path towards opening to the rest of the world. Could you explain to us, and I believe you were in Baghdad a few days ago, could you explain to us what was so specific in this Iraqi modernization in the Middle East of the 20th century, as opposed to the process that was simultaneously taking place in Egypt, for instance, to which we are far more familiar, and how it shaped Sharjah and the adjacent Emirates?
That's a great question, Professor Keppel. I believe, of course, Sharjah and what is today known as the United Arab Emirates are products of their environments as well. We are neighboring to some great civilizations, including Persia, India, of course, and Mesopotamia and other civilizations around us. And we trade over hundreds of years with these civilizations, and there is an exchange of ideas, there is an exchange of goods, there's even an exchange of human beings, in the sense that people move and they immigrate from one part of the Gulf to the other part of the Gulf. This happens with not only with Iraq, but Persia and India. In the case of my family, who lived in India in the middle of the 20th century. To answer your question about Iraq, in fact played an important role in modernization of the Emirates. I can tell you that the private secretary of the ruler of Sharjah in the turn of the century, between the 19th and the 20th century, was an immigrant from Iraq. And he was the individual, Rashid Busneda was his name, and he was the individual who noted down and documented Sharjah at the turn of the century. So without this educated, learned, literate man, we would have not have as much access as we do today to Sharjah around 1880s, 1890s, all the way to the 1910s. And so Iraq, obviously, the fact that Basra is on the Gulf coast also helps because it's a trade route. So people trade from Basra to Kuwait, to Bahrain, Qatar, the Emirates, all the way to Muscat and India. So Iraq, due to its proximity, maybe played an important role in modernization of the Gulf states.
You know, I mean, this sort of global dimension of Sharjah as an anecdotal evidence that supports your demonstration. Last night, I was in Paris sipping a cocktail at Le Select and in the heart of Montparnasse. And I was, having your book with me, just looking at it, trying to get some inspiration. And the waiter looked at the book and said, "Oh, Sharjah, you've been there. All my family is there," and he was from Sri Lanka, actually. This was funny because even as if the guy from Sharjah coming to learn and study in Paris, myself interviewing you, there was the missing link was this guy at Le Select last night in Montparnasse. So earlier on, before Dubai took off at this incredible pace and became this sort of ever-growing postmodern and Arabian version of the city of quartz, to make reference to the title of this famous book by Mike Davis, which he wrote in 1990 about Los Angeles, about his excavating the future of Los Angeles. Before those days, Sharjah looked like it could have become the hub of the United Arab Emirates. Actually, the first Air France flights to the area were non-stops from Paris to Sharjah airport. Then Sharjah's developments took another direction from its neighbor. What happened? Was it a decision of the British to boost Dubai? Was it a choice of the ruling family in Sharjah? In 1995, as you document in the book, there was suddenly the ban on alcohol, and you have some in the book vivid renderings of the fast pace of the sudden closures of bars and nightclubs in your books. And those were followed by the requirements that Sharjah's architecture retained what you called a rather Islamic quote-unquote outlook. And actually, when one drives from Dubai to Sharjah, the contrast at the invisible border in terms of markers between Dubai and Sharjah is immediately visible from the point of view. I mean, the skyscrapers look different. Also, Sharjah boasted some of the most advanced universities in the UAE for a while, particularly its American university, before NYU opened in Abu Dhabi, and maybe the Sorbonne also in the same Emirates. But altogether, when you talk to Sharjah today in the Emirates, in the expat community, it is first and foremost perceived as the bedroom town or the dormitory suburb to Dubai, and one knows he should avoid the commuting traffic jam in the morning and evening. Could you help us understand the whole historical context and how it became like that from your book's perspective?
That's actually a loaded question, but I'll try to unpack it and answer it as fairly as possible. Let me say that it's important to understand the context of any city or any country or any region when you try to analyze, or when the viewers try to understand the historical narrative. So with regards to Sharjah's development, yes, Sharjah was fairly advanced in the 1950s, 60s, and even 70s. Due to a number of issues. Number one, there was the British presence, and the British, of course, had built an airplane, and they had their own clinic, they had their own cinema, so they had vestiges of modernity, although just to be very clear that these vestiges of modernity were mostly only open to the British themselves. This is not open to the locals. So there was rarely times where the locals were allowed into the cinema, for example. And then in the 1950s and 60s, you saw competition come in from Egypt, from Kuwait, from other parts of the region in order to influence Sharjah, because Sharjah was an important, strategically important emirate in the lower Gulf because of the educated population, because of the presence of the British, because of the infrastructure, because of many historical reasons that made Sharjah an important emirate. And then, of course, Sharjah was also a victim of its own success, right? The sense that the attraction of the Egyptians to Sharjah pushed the British to interfere even more. And even with regards to replacing, whoever was in power in the 1960s, they came in and actively sought to change the ruler of Sharjah. So, you're sort of a victim of your own success in that sense, that people take interest in you once you are successful, once you are strategically important. And this applies to any country in the world. With regards to the alcohol ban, I think the alcohol ban also needs to be understood in the context of the region. By 1979-80, a number of factors took place in the region, whether it was the Iranian Revolution, the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviets, the takeover of the mosque in the Grand Mosque, the Haram al-Sharif in Mecca, and many other events that pushed a lot of countries in the region, Professor, to be a bit more conservative. This we saw in places like Yemen, in Pakistan, in Kuwait, where people were a bit more, and even in Qatar, people were more conservative. And I think in Sharjah's, in case of Sharjah, Sharjah decided to take the drastic step of completely banning alcohol. And this was a step that perhaps people locally had, or at least in the Emirates, the nationals may have welcomed, but it did impact the economy of the Emirate. Because you had a revision by the hotels thinking, well, should I build a hotel where where there is a restriction with regards to selling alcoholic beverages? So I believe that step may have impacted the economy of Sharjah, but then I feel like Sharjah managed to find its bearing. And I just want to mention, Professor, one last thing is that Sharjah's economy is quite impressive. Yes, it's smaller than Dubai. Again, there's a number of reasons behind that. And Abu Dhabi, oil was discovered much later. Gas was discovered much later. There was geostrategic reasons or geopolitical reasons. But I think if you consider Sharjah's economy today, it is over $32 or $33 billion. It is bigger than the size of the economy of the state of Vermont in the United States. So again, an East Coast state, a developed state, we are larger than that specific state. We are bigger than many other, even countries in the region. And so, yes, Sharjah is smaller than Dubai and Abu Dhabi. I don't see it as a disadvantage. I see it as Sharjah taking its own time and its own pace with development. And this is the pace that the ruler has chosen for the city. And this is the pace that everybody has adjusted to. But for instance, us as my family being investors in the economy of Sharjah, we have greatly benefited from the real estate, from the banking sector, from the insurance sector. And we haven't seen really the drastically negative impact of that decision. As I said, it may have been a medium to short-term impact, especially when these large hotels reassess their plans. But I feel like now you see all these new hotels coming up in Sharjah targeting family tourism, targeting more a specific set of tourists than, let's say, Ajman, the neighboring emirate of Ajman or the neighboring emirate of Dubai have been doing.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Hagedorn, and I'm the State Department correspondent at Al-Monitor.
And I'm Joe Snell. I'm Al-Monitor's video editor. Let's admit it, this past year has been difficult to stay on top of the news and sift through what's accurate and what's misleading. Let Al-Monitor help you.
If you like this podcast and care about the Middle East and North Africa, you should consider listening to Al-Monitor's other audio series on the Middle East with Andrew Parasalidi and Amberin Zaman, and on Israel with Ben Caspi. You can subscribe to these series on your favorite podcast platforms.
And through a host of free daily and weekly newsletters, we offer a range of perspectives with the highest journalistic standards. You can subscribe to these newsletters at almonitor.com.
As an award-winning media service headquartered in Washington, D.C., Al-Monitor has a network of over 160 contributors around the world.
So if you haven't done so already, be sure to visit almonitor.com, where you can find all of these newsletters and podcasts, along with first-class reporting and analysis.
You also mention in your book that there was at the same time a sort of twist in terms of architecture, like guidance, so that, as I mentioned earlier, when you arrive to Sharjah, because you see the skyscrapers, quote unquote, look Islamic. I mean, they sort of took bits and pieces of sort of Islamic architectural language that you do not see in the high rise of Dubai. Could you place that into perspective? Because before we turn to modernity, to the modernist style? Yes.
So in fact, Sharjah's turn to Islamic architecture started by the late 1970s, but then was codified in law a decade later. So there was some sort of encouragement. You notice that the ruler of Sharjah would commission architects to design buildings like the beautiful Sharjah airport that takes inspiration from Islamic domes and the minaret, for example. And this building was feted and celebrated by many people in the region because of the way that it drew inspiration from Islamic architecture. But however, by 1986-87, Professor, this was codified into law. And the way they did it was that the municipality issued a document that was targeted not towards the owners of buildings, but towards the architectural firms that had licenses to operate in Sharjah, telling them that if you want to make sure that your design isn't rejected, make sure or try to design a building that took inspiration from Islamic architecture. And in fact, they even gave them a guide of what Islamic architecture looks like. So this is, I think, a prime example of almost a top-down model of, almost teaching architects what Islamic architecture is understood as. And if you look at the document, a lot of it is inspired by the architecture of Cairo. And I have a hunch that part of the reason is the ruler of Sharjah himself had studied in Egypt in the 1960s. And so, just like you mentioned me that I was inspired by my time in Paris, that you or anybody is inspired by the time that they spent as a university student. So I feel like this. And by the way, I'm only guessing. This might just be a guess from my side, but I feel like this might be the link here between both.
So it would be the revenge of Cairo against Baghdad to some extent, which was the harbinger of modernity, actually. And to quote another sentence from your introduction, and this is you speaking, we sought to capture an era that once seemed enduring, but now has proven fleeting. So before you answer, let's have a look at this, the following little video I also shot last week in Bank Street, which was the beating heart of the modernist city in the 1970s, which is now not abandoned, but it's not central anymore. It's mutahamish, it's marginal. And in Bank Street, you have all those modernist buildings of the 1970s who stand empty and deserted. Once vibrant offices are to let, with bank signs ripped off, and they just left their shadow on the concrete. Let's have a look at this sort of nostalgic Bank Street era in this little video.
So this is Bank Street, or should we say former Bank Street, because most of the banks are not functioning anymore. Buildings are to let. And this was modernist architecture.
Looking at that, dear Sultan, what would you say was lost that could have happened?
Yes, Professor. In fact, I was greatly encouraged by your video that you just showed and others that I've seen you film, where I saw a sign that instead of saying to be demolished, it said to rent or to let. And I think this is what we need to look at in the UAE, in Sharjah, is to reuse these buildings, these modernist structures, and save them as much as possible. I understand that it's not always possible to do that. And I want to say that Sharjah and the Emirates are once again victims of their own success. Because of the rapid urbanization, there's pressure to demolish 3- and 4-story buildings and build 10 and 20 and even 30-story buildings, because people want to live closer to downtown. People want to have access to certain malls and access to certain avenues. And I feel like over the past 2 years or 3 years, I feel a bit more encouraged because there are laws that have been introduced in Dubai, and a law coming up in 2022 by the federal government in order to protect some of these buildings. And maybe just to answer what we have lost, I think we have lost vestiges of our recent past. I think what's important is to think about these buildings as the immediate reaction to the influx of oil money. What did we do in the 1960s and 70s and 80s? We built these structures. We hired these architects who came from France and from Turkey and from Japan and from India and elsewhere. So what did they produce? They produced these beautiful buildings. And I think we lose a lot when we lose all of them. And perhaps the right thing to do is to balance between destruction and between construction. And there is a saying that I will say, the greenest building is a standing building. So if we want to talk about sustainability, we talk about reuse of existing buildings.
Well, talking about reusing existing buildings, while we speak, we're going to see a third little video, which I shot last year while I'm speaking. Sharjah looks to me as if it were a sort of a testimony of the resilience of what my colleague Alexandre Caserouni called the popolino, the little people or the harbors, in his book The Mirror of the Sheikhs, untranslated from the French, which deals with the politics of museums in the Gulf. And the book documents the resilience of the indigenous society of merchants, of pearl divers, who crossed the waters of the Gulf in their dhows to reach out to the other side, to the Persian side, as we can see in the image now unfolding with all the dhows in the Khor al-Sharqa, the Sharjah Creek, overlooked by the modern buildings of the 1970s and the Radisson Hotel, which ends this little panoramic, which is now closed. The little flags are due to the fact that I shot that during the 50th anniversaries of the UAE, so this dates the video. And the ruler of Sharjah, whom I happened to meet a number of times, always told me that he was very keen to keep a strong link to Persia and to Persian culture. How would you say, in a time when, of course, relations between the two shores of the Gulf are complicated, to use a hyperbolic word, to what extent did Persian culture contribute, do you think, to the molding of the crucial state's identity today?
Oh, that's an excellent question, Professor Keppel. I think that there is no doubt that this exchange of ideas and thoughts and culture and food and music was accelerated on both sides of the Gulf. The fastest avenue in the Gulf until 30 years ago wasn't the desert, it was the ocean, it was the sea. And so we would be able to cross almost on a daily basis between the lower Gulf and the upper Gulf, the Arab townships of the Gulf and the Persian townships of the northern Gulf shore. And I think Iran, being an important civilization and country in the region, I think also greatly contributed in terms of architecture. So if you think of the design of many of the structures that you see, the towns that you see in the lower Gulf, yes, a lot of it was locally inspired, but some of it was also inspired by Iranian motifs, like the peacock, for example, that you see it reflected in a lot of the glass that is shown in the houses. For instance, Professor Keppel, you might not know this, even though you've known me for many years. The name of my foundation, the art foundation Barjeel, is an Arabized Persian word. It's a Farsi word, and it means Badgir, which means wind tower. So we in the Gulf Arabized it and turned it into Barjeel. And for me, it brought in so many different facets of life that I'm interested in, the regionality, architecture, culture, all of this I felt was could be summed up in the idea of the Barjeel. And so Iranian food, Iranian music, Iranian culture, a lot of the words that we use in the Gulf are Persian words, whether they are seafarers or kitchen, words that you use in the kitchen or words that you use in the market. A lot of these are Persian words. So there is a huge exchange of ideas. And the same thing, by the way, goes the other way. The Iranians read their Quran and pray in Arabic. If you think about it, that is the language that all Iranian leaders must know. And this came from the Arabian Peninsula. So the exchange of ideas goes back 1,400 years at least.
So I would like to thank you and end with Ash Barjeel, or long live to Barjeel, as a conclusion. Thank you very much, dear Sultan Sooud al-Qassemi. And next month, we will stay in the Arabian Peninsula, but move further west. And my guest will be Prince Turki al-Faisal al-Sooud on the occasion of the publication of his memoirs from Afghanistan, the Afghan Files. In the meantime, if you have not done so already, please sign up for Reading on the Middle East and al-Monitor's other podcasts on the Middle East with Andrew Parasiliti and Amirin Zaman, and On Israel with Ben Caspit on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you all, and let's meet next month with this other breathtaking interview. Thank you so much.